April 16th, 1945. Berlin. The city is on fire. Soviet artillery has been shelling the German capital around the clock for days. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. The streets smell of ash, burst gas lines, and something worse. And somewhere beneath the Reich Chancellery 50 feet underground, in a concrete bunker lit by flickering fluorescent lights, the most powerful men in Nazi Germany are gathered together. They know. Not one of them says it out loud. But every person in that room, every general, every aide, every true believer who has followed Adolf Hitler from the Munich beer halls to the ruins of Berlin knows exactly what is happening. These were men who controlled armies across 3 continents. They commanded secret police that could make anyone disappear. They held life and death authority over hundreds of millions of human beings. At the height of their power, they occupied half of Europe and declared themselves the architects of a new civilization that would last 1,000 years. That civilization had lasted 12. And now, each of these men was going to face a very specific kind of ending. Some chose a bullet, some chose a capsule, some walked into a gymnasium in Nuremberg and climbed 13 steps to a wooden platform in the middle of the night. Some tried to run and didn't make it far enough. And one of them, the single most outrageous case in this entire story, managed to pull off a final act of defiance so calculated, so deliberately theatrical, so perfectly insulting to justice, that even the men responsible for carrying out the sentence were left standing in an empty room wondering how it happened. I'll tell you exactly who that was, and exactly how he did it. But to understand the endings, you need to understand what these men believed right up until the moment belief became impossible. Because that belief, that specific brand of arrogance and self-delusion, is what makes each of these endings reveal something true about who they really were. If you want deep dive historical analysis of World War II, Nazi Germany, and the legal and moral reckoning that followed, subscribe right now. It helps the channel grow and tells me you want more of this. And here's the comment question I want you to think about as we go through this. These men were given lawyers, translators, fair trials, and the chance to speak their last words. Do you think they deserved any of that? Drop your answer below. I read every single one. All right, let's start where it all ended. April 30th, 1945. The Führer bunker, Berlin. 12 days earlier, Adolf Hitler had turned 56 years old. His staff brought cake. Soviet forces were 25 miles from the city. The party was brief. By the morning of April 30th, the Red Army was fighting block by block less than a mile from the bunker entrance. Hitler had been awake most of the night. He had already said his goodbyes to the staff. He had already ordered his body to be burned. Not buried, not preserved, burned. Because 2 days earlier, he had received word about what Italian partisans had done to Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had been captured trying to flee north. He was shot on April 28th. His body was driven to Milan and hung upside down from the roof of a gas station for the public to see, spit on, and throw things at. Hitler had photographs brought to him. He studied them. He said nothing. And then he issued instructions. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, Hitler and his wife, Eva Braun, they had married in a small civil ceremony in the bunker just 36 hours earlier, withdrew to his private study and closed the door. The shot was heard at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. When staff entered minutes later, both were dead. Eva had taken cyanide. Hitler had used his personal pistol, a Walther PPK. Their bodies were carried to the Reich Chancellery garden, placed in a shallow trench soaked with fuel, and set alight while Soviet artillery shells landed less than a mile away. Hitler's last logistical act had been to arrange the destruction of his own evidence. No body, no trophy, no trial. No moment where he would have to sit across from the people he had destroyed and hear them describe what he had done. Here's what you need to understand about that choice. It wasn't cowardice. Cowardice would have been begging. What Hitler did was calculated. He removed himself from the equation before the equation could remove him. He chose the ending. He wrote the last line. And that instinct, the refusal to be defined by anyone other than himself, is the thread that runs through almost every death on this list. Almost. Because the man who was arguably more responsible for the physical machinery of the Holocaust than Hitler himself died in a way that was almost comically undignified by comparison. His name was Heinrich Himmler, and by April 1945, he had convinced himself that he was still relevant. Think about what that means. Himmler was the Reichsführer SS. He had built the SS from a personal bodyguard unit of 280 men into a state within a state of nearly 1 million. He had overseen the construction and operation of the concentration camps. His signature was on documents authorizing the murder of millions of human beings. And in April 1945, he secretly contacted Count Folke Bernadotte, a Swedish diplomat, and proposed a deal. He, Heinrich Himmler, would offer Germany's surrender to the Western Allies. In exchange, he expected to be treated as a legitimate head of state. The Allies didn't just reject the offer, they broadcast it. When Hitler received word, he stripped Himmler of all titles by radio transmission from the bunker. Himmler was finished, He was a fugitive. He fled. He obtained forged papers under the name Heinrich Hitzinger. He shaved his mustache. He put on a Wehrmacht sergeant's uniform and joined a column of men walking west toward a British checkpoint. The man who had run the most sophisticated surveillance network in human history was now hoping no one recognized his face. On May 21st, 1945, a checkpoint near Bremerwörde stopped his group. Something about one of them, the nervous one, the one whose bearing didn't match his rank, caught the sergeant's attention. He was separated and taken in for interrogation. He held out for 2 days. Then, on May 23rd, a British medical officer came to conduct a routine examination. The moment the doctor moved to inspect his mouth, Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule he had been hiding in his cheek the entire time. He was dead in under 15 minutes. The man who administered the final solution died on a British army floor in Nuremberg with a fake name in his pocket, wearing a borrowed uniform, with no grave, no trial, and no public accounting for a single decision he had ever made. In the end, Himmler and Hitler were more alike than either would have admitted. Now, while those two men chose to vanish, the man in charge of telling Germany what to think made a completely different calculation. Joseph Goebbels stayed. Let that sink in for a moment, because it's the most revealing thing about him. Goebbels was Reich Minister of Propaganda, the man who turned National Socialism from a street movement into a mass phenomenon. He understood audiences better than anyone in Hitler's circle. He controlled radio, film, newspapers, and public spectacle. He was, by every historical account, the most intellectually dangerous man in the entire regime. And when Berlin was falling and every senior Nazi who could run was running, Goebbels brought his wife Magda and their 6 children into the bunker. Their names were Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun. The oldest was 12. The youngest was 4. Hitler had named Goebbels Reich Chancellor in his final political testament. Goebbels accepted the title. He held it for approximately 1 day. On the evening of May 1st, 1945, after Hitler was already dead and Soviet forces were fighting in the streets above them, Goebbels and his wife sedated their 6 children and administered cyanide to each of them. Then, Joseph and Magda Goebbels went outside. Both died in the Reich Chancellery Garden that night. The man who had spent 20 years constructing reality for other people's consumption spent his final hours constructing one last scene. He chose the location. He chose the method. He made sure no version of his story would be written by anyone else, even if writing that final line meant including his own children in it. There's no way to look at that ending without understanding something cold and permanent about who Goebbels was. But here's what makes Goebbels' end almost look simple compared to what came next. Because the 4th member of Hitler's inner circle, the man who commanded the Luftwaffe, founded the Gestapo, and considered himself the Führer's rightful successor, didn't flee, didn't hide, didn't try to rewrite his ending at all. He decided he was going to win. His name was Hermann Goering, and what he did at Nuremberg is unlike anything else in this entire story. When American troops found Goering on May 9th, 1945 in the Austrian mountains, he had surrendered willingly. He arrived with 2 suitcases and his personal staff. Witnesses described him as carrying himself like a man arriving at a diplomatic summit. He had also packed more than 20,000 paracodeine pills. He was severely addicted. The Americans cut him off immediately. Over the following weeks, Goering lost nearly 60 pounds. His face sharpened. His mind, dulled for years by addiction, fully re-engaged. By the time the Nuremberg trial opened in November 1945, Goering was the most dangerous man in the courtroom. Prison psychologists measured his IQ at 138, the highest of any defendant. He studied the prosecution's case like a general planning a counterattack. He coached other defendants on what to admit, what to deny. And when the prosecution finally called him to the stand, he performed. He argued, he challenged. He made American Chief Prosecutor, Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, look visibly unprepared on multiple occasions. Observers in the gallery audibly reacted to exchanges he won. The courtroom understood. This was a man who had decided the Nuremberg trial was not a sentencing. It was a debate, and he intended to win it. He didn't. The tribunal found him guilty on all 4 counts. The sentence was death by hanging. On the evening of October 15th, 1946, the night before the scheduled executions, Allied correspondents were allowed into the cell block to observe the condemned men through their windows. What they saw was telling. Ribbentrop was in intense conversation with the prison chaplain. Sokol was pacing the floor, visibly trembling. Jodl was writing a letter, and Goering was lying on his cot, eyes closed, hands folded across his blanket, simulating sleep. At 10:45, that same night, a guard making rounds noticed Goering twitching beneath his blanket. When the cell was opened, he was in the final stages of cyanide poisoning. A doctor arrived. The death rattle was already in his throat. Hermann Goering was dead before midnight. In his cell, they found a small envelope containing 3 letters, one to the prison commandant, one to his wife, one explaining exactly what he had done. The empty cartridge case that had concealed the vial was there too. He had kept it hidden for 18 months, through daily cell searches, through medical examinations, most likely concealed in a body cavity the entire time. Here's the detail that makes this the most calculated act of defiance in the entire Nuremberg story. When Allied investigators reviewed his original capture records, they found that Goering had arrived in American custody carrying 3 cyanide capsules. One was found immediately during the initial search, the one he allowed them to find. A second was discovered in his belongings. Another one he left where it would be noticed. The third he carried inside himself, hidden for every single day of the Nuremberg proceedings. He had planted 2 decoys and held the third in reserve. He waited to see if his performance in the courtroom would save him. When it didn't, he used what he had been holding the entire time. The execution, the one act the International Military Tribunal had the authority to carry out, the one moment that belonged to the victims, Goering simply took away. They brought his body into the gymnasium anyway and laid it on a stretcher between the 2 gallows, removed the blanket so every witness could confirm he was definitively dead, then covered him and carried him behind the canvas curtain. Even as a corpse, he was controlling the room. Now, the executioners had 10 men left. October 16th, 1946. Just after 1:00 in the morning, Nuremberg Prison Gymnasium. 3 gallows had been constructed, 2 used in alternating rotation, 1 held in reserve. The total process would take just over 3.5 hours. What you need to understand before we go through each man is that these were not abstract figures being processed through a legal system. These were human beings, each of whom had spent years exercising absolute power over other human beings, now standing at the top of 13 stairs, facing a room full of witnesses, with roughly 45 seconds between their last words and the trapdoor. And in those 45 seconds, each one revealed one final time exactly who they were. Joachim von Ribbentrop entered the execution chamber first, at 1:11 in the morning. He had been Hitler's foreign minister, the man who personally negotiated the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939, giving Hitler the diplomatic freedom to invade Poland and ignite the war. He had joined the Nazi movement not out of ideology, but opportunity. A career opportunist who used it to become one of the most powerful diplomats in Europe. The night before, correspondents had seen him through his cell window in deep conversation with the prison chaplain. His face was white. He walked steadily into the chamber. When the officer asked his name, Ribbentrop didn't answer. The officer repeated the question. Then Ribbentrop almost shouted it, "Joachim von Ribbentrop," and mounted the stairs without hesitation. On the platform, his jaw was tight, his head raised with what witnesses described as his old arrogance. When asked for his final message, he said first, in German, "God protect Germany." Then he paused. He asked, "May I say something else?" The interpreter nodded. "My last wish is that Germany should recover her unity and that, for the sake of peace, there should be an understanding between East and West. I wish peace to the world." The man who had spent 6 years engineering the diplomatic conditions for the most destructive war in human history asked God's mercy, and then wished peace to the world from a gallows platform. Just before the hood went on, he turned to the prison chaplain and whispered 3 words. "I'll see you again." He was pronounced dead at 1:30 a.m. Wilhelm Keitel entered the chamber while Ribbentrop's body still hung behind the curtain. Keitel was the chief of the high command of the entire German armed forces. His signature appeared on the Commissar order, authorizing the summary execution of Soviet political officers. His signature appeared on the Night and Fog Decree, the order that made civilian resistors simply disappear into the camp system without trial, without notification to their families. His defense? He was a soldier following orders. The moral responsibility lay with the politicians above him. The tribunal rejected that defense in terms that would become foundational to international law. Keitel walked to the gallows as if mounting a reviewing stand, head high, back straight, 40 years of Prussian military bearing, and he was not going to break it in the last 90 seconds of his life. His last words, in a full, clear voice, "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their death for the fatherland before me. I follow now my sons, all for Germany." Then the trap was sprung. Here is the detail almost no account of that night includes. The trapdoor was too small. The gallows were poorly designed. As Keitel dropped, the back of his head struck the edge of the platform. Several men that night suffered the same. The executioner, U.S. Army Master Sergeant John C. Woods, used the standard drop rather than the long drop, meaning the fall was not long enough to guarantee an immediate broken neck. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, some executions that night took between 14 and 28 minutes. The Army denied this publicly, but the men died, every one of them. Keitel was pronounced dead at 1:44 a.m. Ernst Kaltenbrunner entered the chamber at 1:36 in the morning, wearing a sweater beneath a blue double-breasted coat, his face lean and haggard, crossed with old dueling scars. He was head of the RSHA, the organization that administered the Gestapo and coordinated the extermination camps, the most senior SS official to survive the war and face trial. He had spent every day of the Nuremberg proceedings denying knowledge of things his own signature appeared on. Document after document bore his name. He responded to each one the same way. He was a figurehead, a man without real authority. The extermination program had run without his knowledge. He wet his lips climbing the stairs, the only visible sign of nerves from a man who had spent years projecting absolute control. His last words, delivered in a calm, low voice. I have loved my German people and my fatherland with a warm heart. I have done my duty by the laws of my people, and I am sorry my people were led this time by men who were not soldiers, and that crimes were committed of which I had no knowledge. Then, as the hood was raised over his head, he added quietly in German, Germany, good luck? One of his agents, a man named Rudolf Höss, had confessed at trial to gassing 3 million human beings at Auschwitz under Kaltenbrunner's direct orders. He was pronounced dead at 1:52 a.m. Alfred Rosenberg entered the chamber 6 minutes later. Rosenberg was the Nazi Party's chief ideologist. He had built the pseudoscientific racial framework that gave the Holocaust its intellectual justification. Books, papers, lectures, arguing that eliminating certain groups of human beings was not a crime, but a biological correction. His writings were assigned in German schools, quoted in party speeches, used as the foundation for the racial laws that stripped Jewish Germans of their citizenship. More words in service of mass murder than almost anyone else in the regime. He walked to the platform steady and pale. His complexion was, in the words of Kingsbury Smith, the eyewitness reporter who documented that entire night for the International News Service, pasty brown. Despite his avowed atheism, a Protestant chaplain stood beside him on the gallows platform and prayed. Rosenberg glanced at him once, expressionless. When asked if he had a final statement, Alfred Rosenberg said one word, no. Then the hood, then the trap. 90 seconds from when he mounted the steps to when the rope went taut, the swiftest execution of the 10. The man who had built a 20-year argument for why certain people deserved to die had nothing to say at the moment of his own death. Hans Frank entered the chamber as the only one to walk in with a smile. He was nervous, swallowing frequently, visibly unsteady, but witnesses said he appeared relieved, as if this was the destination he had been moving toward since finding his faith in a Nuremberg cell. Frank had been Governor-General of occupied Poland. Auschwitz was in his territory. Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. Approximately 3 million Polish Jews were murdered on land he administered. But unlike almost every other defendant at Nuremberg, Frank had acknowledged it. He converted to Catholicism. He told the tribunal that 1,000 years would not suffice to erase Germany's guilt. By every account, he had genuinely confronted the weight of what happened on his watch. He was still going to hang. His last words, barely a whisper, I am thankful for the kind treatment during my captivity, and I ask God to accept me with mercy. The man who had administered the murder of 3 million people whispered for mercy and went through the trap. He was pronounced dead at 2:08 a.m. Wilhelm Frick entered the chamber at 2:05 in the morning. He was 69 years old. Frick was Reich Minister of the Interior, the man who drafted the Nuremberg race laws in 1935. Those laws stripped Jewish Germans of their citizenship, banned marriage between Jews and non-Jews, and created the legal architecture that made everything that followed possible. Without the Nuremberg race laws, the deportations, the theft of property, the extermination program itself, none of it would have had a legal foundation. Frick built that foundation. He signed it into law. He seemed the least steady of any man who had entered that room. He stumbled on the 13th step, the last step before the platform. Guards moved to steady him. His last words were 4. Long live eternal Germany. Then the trap. He was pronounced dead at 2:20 a.m. Julius Streicher made his entrance at 2:12 in the morning, and nothing about it was quiet. Streicher was the editor of Der Stürmer, the Nazi Party's flagship anti-Semitic newspaper, which he had run for more than 20 years with a ferocity that went beyond ideology into something closer to obsession. His paper had printed cartoons, articles, and fabricated stories depicting Jewish people as subhuman predators. It had been displayed in public cases on street corners across Germany. Children had read it in schools. Streicher had spent 2 decades manufacturing the hatred that allowed ordinary Germans to look away. He arrived in the execution chamber wearing a threadbare suit and a worn shirt buttoned to the collar but no tie. He was ugly, small, and twitching. He looked around the room, at the 3 gallows, at the witnesses, and his face was working. When guards stopped him at the foot of the steps for the identification formality, he let out a piercing scream. Heil Hitler! Kingsbury Smith, standing in that room, wrote afterward that the shriek sent a shiver down his back. When the officer asked his name, Stryker shouted, "You know my name well." The interpreter repeated the question. "Julius Stryker." As he reached the gallows platform, he cried, "Now it goes to God!" Then he was swung to face the witnesses, and he glared at them. Then he screamed, "Purim Fest 1946. Purim is the Jewish holiday that commemorates the defeat of Haman, the ancient persecutor of the Jewish people described in the Book of Esther. Stryker, in his final conscious moment, compared his execution to a Jewish celebration of justice over genocide. The officer present asked if he had any last words. Stryker shouted, "The Bolsheviks will hang you one day." As the black hood went over his head, his muffled voice said one final thing, "Adele, my dear wife." Then the trap. The rope snapped taut. Groans were heard from within the covered scaffold. It took time for the movement to stop. Fritz Sauckel entered next. Sauckel was the Third Reich's plenipotentiary general for labor deployment, the man who organized the forced conscription of approximately 5 million workers from across occupied Europe. Men, women, and children seized from their homes and shipped to German factories, mines, and farms, where tens of thousands died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and abuse. When the death sentence was announced at Nuremberg, Sauckel had not expected it. He broke down in the courtroom. He wept. He had genuinely convinced himself that, as an organizer of labor, rather than a direct perpetrator of killing, he would receive a lighter sentence. He did not. Wearing a sweater with no coat, his eyes wild, he was the most defiant of all the men, except Stryker. His last words were shouted from the gallows platform, "I am dying innocent. The sentence is wrong. God protect Germany and make Germany great again. Long live Germany. God protect my family." The trap was sprung at 2:26 a.m. The man who had enslaved 5 million people died screaming that he was innocent. Alfred Jodl entered ninth, his Wehrmacht uniform collar half turned up, as if he had dressed in the dark. He walked unsteadily, lips wet, features drawn, a visible contrast to Keitel's military precision. Jodl had been Germany's chief military planner for most of the war. He argued throughout his trial that military officers execute policy and bear no individual responsibility for the consequences. On the night the verdict was announced, he had told the prison psychologist 3 words, "Death by hanging." Then a pause. That, at least, I did not deserve. On the platform, Jodl's last words were 6. "My greetings to you, my eternal Germany." 6 words, then the trap. He was pronounced dead at 2:50 a.m. Arthur Seyss-Inquart was the last man to die that night. He entered the chamber at 2:38 in the morning, wearing glasses that made his face an easily remembered image. He looked around with visible unsteadiness and limped on a clubfoot, a condition he had carried since birth, to the gallows. He had been Reich Commissioner for the occupied Netherlands. Under his administration, of the approximately 140,000 Jews living in the Netherlands, roughly 107, 0 were deported and killed. Fewer than 5 0 survived. Anne Frank and her family were arrested in Amsterdam in August 1944 during his tenure. Anne Frank died in Bergen-Belsen in February 1945, 2 months before liberation. He mounted the steps slowly, guards on each arm. His final words, quiet and deliberate, "I hope that this execution is the last act of the tragedy of the Second World War, and that the lesson taken from this war will be that peace and understanding should exist between peoples. I believe in Germany." He dropped to his death at 2:45 a.m. He was pronounced dead at 2:59 in the morning. 10 men, just under 2 hours. Done. The gymnasium doors opened one final time and guards carried in a stretcher. On it was Goering, covered by a khaki army blanket, one blue silk-clad arm hanging over the side, bare feet visible at the other end. The Allied Committee had decided his body would be formally presented, not to honor him, but to prevent any legend forming that he had escaped. They removed the blanket. Every witness confirmed Goering was dead. His face, in the words of Kingsbury Smith, was still contorted with the pain of his last agonizing moments and his final gesture of defiance. They covered him quickly, carried him behind the curtain, and it was over. Not every major figure made it to Nuremberg. Some didn't survive long enough. Robert Ley had been head of the German Labor Front, the organization that replaced every independent trade union in Germany. He was indicted as a primary defendant. He had a lawyer, a translator, a cell. On October 25th, 1945, 3 weeks before the trial was to begin, guards found Ley dead. He had torn strips from his towel, stuffed rags in his mouth so no one would hear, and strangled himself against the toilet fixture. He chose this instead of the courtroom. Reinhard Heydrich never had the option of a trial. He was head of the RSHA and the primary architect of the final solution. He was 37 years old when he chaired the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, the meeting at which senior Nazi officials coordinated the logistics of the systematic murder of European Jews. On May 27, 1942, Czech and Slovak agents trained by the British Special Operations Executive ambushed his open-topped Mercedes in Prague. He survived the initial attack, but developed septicemia and died on June 4, 1942. He was 38 years old. Hitler ordered reprisals of a scale that shocked even hardened observers. The village of Lidity was obliterated. Every man was shot. Every woman and child was sent to the camps. The village was burned and bulldozed until nothing remained above the surface. That is what the men in this story were capable of. Then there is Martin Bormann, the ghost that haunted the post-war period for 50 years. By the end of the war, Bormann was arguably the most powerful man in Germany after Hitler himself. His title was head of the party chancellery. What it meant in practice was that every document, every request, every message that reached Hitler passed through Bormann first. He controlled access to the Führer and used that position to eliminate rivals and make himself indispensable. He was convicted at Nuremberg in absentia and sentenced to death, because nobody knew where he was. For decades, credible sightings were reported in Argentina, Spain, Paraguay. Nazi hunters followed leads across South America for 25 years. There were serious investigators convinced he was living under a false identity, watching the trials from a distance. The truth was confirmed by DNA analysis in 1998. Bormann had never made it out of Berlin. Skeletal remains found during construction work in 1972 were eventually confirmed as his. The forensic evidence indicates cyanide, taken sometime during the night of May 1st to 2nd, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in. The most powerful bureaucrat in the Third Reich died alone in a Berlin street, in the dark, running. No trial, no gallows, just bones under a construction site. Found 27 years later, not every senior Nazi was executed. Not everyone went to prison. Albert Speer was Hitler's chief architect and, from 1942, Reich Minister of Armaments. His management of the German war economy is credited by historians with extending the war by 2 to 3 years. At Nuremberg, Speer positioned himself as an apolitical professional, a man who built things, not a man who made ideological decisions. He distanced himself from the Holocaust, expressed apparent remorse, and appeared genuinely troubled. Several judges found him sympathetic. He was sentenced to 20 years. He served every day. Released in 1966, wrote 2 best-selling memoirs that cemented his image as the so-called good Nazi, the insider who served without fully believing, who tried to stop things at the end. Historians have spent 5 decades dismantling that image. The evidence that Speer knew about the extermination program, not vaguely but specifically, is now considered by most scholars to be overwhelming. He died of natural causes in London in 1981, a wealthy man, a celebrated author. There is no satisfying conclusion to draw from Albert Speer's life. That's precisely what makes it the most disturbing case on this list. And then there were the ones the trials never reached at all. Adolf Eichmann organized the logistics of the Holocaust, not the ideology, the scheduling, the trains, the timetables, the bureaucratic coordination that moved millions to the camps with the efficiency of a supply chain. He fled to Argentina using forged documents. He lived there for 15 years as Ricardo Clement, working at a Mercedes-Benz factory in Buenos Aires. Israeli Mossad agents located him in 1960 and seized him from a street near his home on May 11th, smuggling him to Israel in secret. He was tried in Jerusalem in 1961. His defense, he was merely following orders. An administrator, not a decision-maker. The court rejected it completely. He was convicted and executed by hanging on June 1st, 1962, the only civilian execution ever carried out by the State of Israel. Joseph Mengele was never tried, never captured. The SS physician who conducted selection on the Auschwitz platform, deciding with a glance who went to the labor camps and who went directly to the gas chambers, fled to South America and spent the rest of his life moving when the net seemed to close in. Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, protected at various points by former SS networks. On February 7th, 1979, Mengele suffered a stroke while swimming near Bertioga, Brazil, and drowned. He was 67 years old. He had never faced a courtroom. His remains were identified forensically in 1985. Brazil confirmed it in 1992. That is the ending Joseph Mengele got. Now here's what you need to sit with when you lay all of these endings side by side. They don't resolve into a satisfying story. Some men were executed. Some went to prison and were eventually released. Some lived into old age and never answered for anything. Some died running. Some died alone on a British Army floor or in a Berlin street. But here's what you need to understand. There are really only 4 categories, and each one tells you something different about what absolute power does to a person when it finally runs out. The first is the ones who chose their own exit. Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels. Men who decided that accountability, being reduced from Führer to defendant, being judged, was intolerable. They removed themselves before the equation could remove them. The second is the men who climbed the 13 steps. 10 men in a gymnasium in the early hours of October 16th, 1946. Men who faced a court, heard the verdict, and paid the sentence. Some with dignity, some screaming it was wrong. All of them. The third is imprisonment. Speer, Dönitz, Hess, who lived 46 years in a cell and may or may not have chosen his own end at 93. Men who survived the trials, served time, and in some cases walked out to live more years in freedom than many of their victims ever had. And the fourth, the one that sits most uncomfortably, is escape. The Mengeles. Men who died on their own terms, in their own time, never having answered for anything. Here's the question that the Nuremberg trials forced the world to confront, and that this fourth category makes impossible to answer cleanly. Was Nuremberg justice, or was it the beginning of justice? Before Nuremberg, no codified principle in international law established that individuals bear personal criminal responsibility for crimes against humanity, regardless of what the state authorized, regardless of what orders they followed. After Nuremberg, that principle existed. Every international criminal tribunal operating since 1946, every war crimes prosecution in The Hague, every case brought before an international court on behalf of victims who had no other mechanism, all of it traces directly to those proceedings, to those judges deciding what to do with men who had crossed lines that had never before been defined in law. Before we close, if this kind of analysis is what you come here for, hit like right now. It helps the algorithm and tells me to keep making content at this level. And drop your answer in the comments. Was execution the right sentence? Or would life imprisonment, forced to wake up every day and face what they had done, aging behind walls, outliving their ideology, have been the more meaningful punishment? There is no clean answer. That's exactly why I want to know what you think. Now, I told you at the beginning that one man pulled off the single most outrageous act of defiance in the Nuremberg story. The most calculated, the most theatrical, the most deliberately insulting to justice. You know who it was now, but I want you to understand what made it outrageous beyond just the act itself. Goering had carried that capsule for 18 months, through the trial, through the guilty verdict, through the death sentence. He held it in reserve the entire time, waiting to see if his performance was enough to save him, and planning for the possibility that it wasn't. His letter to the prison commandant, found after his death, was almost satisfied with itself. He explained where he had hidden the capsule. He explained how he had kept it through every search. He documented one final successful operation. Even the note was performance. And here's the line that makes Goering's ending the key to understanding all the others. Every man in this story made one final choice about what mattered most to them. Hitler chose control over legacy. No body, no trial, no moment where someone else wrote the ending. Himmler chose his own death over the humiliation of standing trial. Goebbels chose the story over everything, including his children. Ribbentrop asked God's mercy and wished peace to the world after engineering a war. Keitel died a Prussian officer to the last second. Kaltenbrunner died insisting he knew nothing, with his own name on the documents. Rosenberg said nothing, like the architect of genocide went silent at the one moment when words might have mattered. Frank whispered for mercy. Frick said 4 words. Streicher spent his last breath screaming Heil Hitler and calling the execution a Jewish holiday. Sokol screamed that it was wrong. Jodl said goodbye to his eternal Germany. Seyss-Inquart hoped for peace, and Goering chose to win. That instinct, the absolute refusal to submit, to be judged, to have his ending written by anyone other than himself, is the most concentrated expression of what National Socialism actually was. The belief that the powerful determine what justice means, that ordinary consequences apply to everyone except them, that the rules are written by the strong for the strong, and the strong do not hang. They were wrong. The world they built is gone. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. The empire that was supposed to reorganize civilization collapsed into rubble, and the rubble was cleared away, and the streets were rebuilt, and the cities they burned built themselves back up, and the people they tried to erase are still here. These men are names in trial transcripts now. Their endings are studied not because of what they achieved, but because of what they lost, and what the world built from the wreckage of their losing. The victims are the ones the world has spent 80 years working to remember. Every name, every face, every person reduced to a number, to a file, to a column in a deportation schedule. The men in this video spent their entire careers trying to make those people disappear from history. History remembered the victims anyway, and the men who tried to erase them became footnotes in the legal framework built to make sure it never happens again. If this video gave you something to think about, a detail that stayed with you, a question you're still sitting with, an ending that surprised you, drop it in the comments right now. Tell me which man's final moment hit you the hardest. Tell me which ending felt like the most complete injustice. Tell me which one you're still thinking about. I read every single comment, everyone. And if you want more content like this, deep dives into the trials, the evidence, the decisions that shape the world we live in, subscribe. There's a lot more coming. I'll see you in the next one.